Okay, now we get into our gospel reading from Mark chapter 9, verses 30 through 37. Jesus and his disciples left from there and began a journey through Galilee, but he did not wish anyone to know about it. He was teaching his disciples and telling them, "The Son of Man is to be handed over to men, and they will kill him. And 3 days after his death, the Son of Man will rise." But they did not understand the saying, and they were afraid to question him. They came to Capernaum, and once inside the house, he began to ask them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they remained silent. They had been discussing among themselves on the way who was the greatest. Then he sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "If anyone wishes to be first, he shall be the last of all and the servant of all." Taking a child, he placed it in their midst, and putting his arms around it, he said to them, "Whoever receives one child such as this in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but the one who sent me." Okay, this is good. We skipped over a whole bunch in chapter 9. So last week we heard right almost up to the end of chapter 8. We skipped just a couple of verses, but within the same thing, where Jesus says, whoever wants to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. So that's the whole thing. Is like the condition for being a disciple of Jesus is self-denial, taking up your cross, which for them was a sign of humiliation, public humiliation of being a criminal. So this is what he says. You must do this. Okay, so now we skip over a part, and what is that part? That part is the transfiguration. When Jesus, right after telling them, he takes Peter, James, and John up a mountain to pray, and while he's up there, he's transfigured. He changes. His clothes change to their dazzling white. He begins glowing or radiating with the divine light. And this is while Peter and James and John, they see it. And then they come down the mountain, and when they get down the mountain, there's a boy with a demon that the rest of the apostles have been trying to cast out the demon. Because they've been given this power to cast out demons, but for whatever reason they can't cast out this one, so Jesus himself does it. And then from there we jump into Jesus and his second prediction of his passion. So it's kind of a strange thing that we skip over a chunk, but in a kind of way for most of the apostles, for 9 out of the 12, Peter, James, and John are the exceptions to this. For 9 out of the 12, they don't know that they miss something. For all they know, Jesus is gone, and so are the other 3. Peter, James, and John, but they don't know what they're up to. So that's big. Of course, they've seen Jesus perform this miracle, but nonetheless, he now comes back to them, and it says from that place of casting out the demon from the boy, it says that they go on a journey. But Jesus, for some reason, he didn't want anyone to know about it. This thing that we see in Mark, maybe in the other Gospels too, but for sure in Mark, we see this like messianic secret where it's just like Jesus, he doesn't quite want people to know about him yet. He doesn't want people to know always when he's on the move or those kinds of things. And it's a little confusing why that's the case. But I, as I mentioned before, I suppose it's because he knows that there's a proper time for everything, and that if everything becomes so widely known, he just cast out a demon from this boy, and if everything becomes so widely known, then perhaps the timing will be will not go according to plan. And of course he intends things to go according to plan because it's the divine plan. So anyway, so that's the case. But then as they're going, it says he was teaching his disciples and telling them. So Jesus teaches to be a disciple is to be a student. So it's like you got to learn from your teacher. And so Jesus, of course, is teaching them. But what is it that he's teaching them? Well, he's teaching them the same thing that we heard, or at least partly the same thing that we heard last week, where he says the Son of Man is to be handed over to men, and they will kill him. And 3 days after his death, the Son of Man will rise. So it sounds similar to what we heard last week, but it's a different instance. This is the second time in the Gospel of Mark that Jesus predicts his passion and his resurrection, for that matter. And that's the resurrection seems like it gets skipped over. Last week, what does Jesus do after he explains to them all these things? Peter rebukes him. Like Jesus talked about how he was going to rise from the dead, and Peter pulls him aside and says, "No, this isn't going to happen. It's not going to be that way." He rebukes him, a sharp word of criticism. And now here he says, okay, well, this is going to happen. I'm going to be killed, and 3 days later, I'm going to rise. But notice what it says. They did not understand the saying, and they were afraid to question him. So this is kind of strange. So Jesus calls himself the Son of Man. So that's for the Jewish people, they wouldn't know this term. It comes from the book of Daniel, chapter 7 specifically, but I think other chapters in there. We're talking about this messianic figure, which, remember last week, Peter proclaims Jesus. He declares him to be the Christ. And it's not that makes him the Christ. He is the Christ. But Peter recognizes him as the Christ. So he recognizes him as the long-awaited Messiah, who is the Son of Man. And so Jesus is saying the Son of Man is going to be handed over. But the Son of Man in the book of Daniel is seen in glory. He comes on the clouds with glory. So it's very possible that the apostles, it says, they didn't understand and they were afraid to question him. It's possible that they didn't, it's not matching up with their image of who the Messiah is supposed to be. He's supposed to come on the clouds with glory. And here Jesus is talking about how he's going to be handed over and killed. As though, again, they just it seems like they missed the part about him rising from the dead, or maybe they don't understand what it means for him to rise. That could be the case. There could also be the sense of, well, we're his disciples, and if he's going to be killed, what does that mean about us? That could very well be the case. Either way, we don't know what was in their mind because it just says that they were afraid to question him. They were afraid, and so they didn't ask him about, like, gosh, Jesus, what are you talking about right now? This sounds crazy. They didn't. They were afraid, and so they kept their mouths shut, which is kind of unfortunate that would be the case, because it would be fun to see that dialogue, what that looked like. Anyway, so then they come to Capernaum, and they get into the house, and Jesus is like, what were you arguing about? So they're arguing. Other translations say they were discussing, and it even says later that they had been discussing on the way who was the greatest. But notice their response. So Jesus says, what were you arguing about? And they just remain silent. This shameful thing, because remember, like most recently, they heard Jesus say that whoever wishes to come after him must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow him. In other words, whoever wants to follow him and be his disciple needs to be willing to be humiliated. And not just willing to, but like must be, like you got to deny yourself. They're meanwhile, right after that, they can't get their eyes or their minds off of their desire for power, for prestige, for honor. And so that's what they're arguing about. Who's the greatest one? I'm the greatest. You're the greatest. Whatever. Like they're arguing about this, and Jesus, like he must have known. He clearly must have known what they were arguing about. But again, it's like he presents this invitation for them to come and just say, like, Jesus, we can't get our minds off of our desire for power, for prestige, for honor. But instead, they remain silent. Just to imagine that tragedy of having to stand before Jesus silent because you're afraid and ashamed to tell him what you've been thinking. Sometimes this happens. People don't go to confession because they're afraid or ashamed of what they've done. When in reality, like, this is the very thing that priests want to hear. And like Jesus through the priest, it's the very thing that we want to hear, is people who are truly like, I'm embarrassed about this, but I did this and I feel bad. Like, what a gift. That's a gift of repentance, But these guys here, they didn't. So anyway, so then Jesus is like, okay, well, this is another teaching moment. So he sits down, he calls them, and he says, if anyone wishes to be first, he shall be the last of all and the first of all, the servant of all, actually. So this is, it's unfortunate, in a written text, you can't always get the tone of voice that comes across. And so we don't know if Jesus is like, okay, here's the deal, you guys, you got to get this in. Or if it's just like, okay, let's talk about this. And I know that depending on who you are, you might prefer one of those voices or the other. Maybe you have a different voice in mind for the Lord. Either way, what we have is his teaching. Whoever wishes to be first needs to be last. And whoever wants to be first needs to be the servant of all. That word servant is diakonos, which we get for us as Catholics and Christians in general, I guess. But we get the word deacon. So what did deacons ordain to do? They're ordained to serve. Actually, they serve the priest at the Mass and the bishop. They tend to serve the parish through caring for those who are elderly or in prison or homebound, whatever. Like they tend to be men of service because Jesus says whoever wishes to be first needs to be the last of all and the servant of all. And then what's more, he takes a child, he places it in their midst, he puts his arms around it, and he says, okay, here's the deal. This child. So think of a child from first century context. Children were fairly insignificant. They were not, like in today's world, the children kind of rule the house. It's like the children's schedule in a lot of places, not in all places, but a lot of families. You look around and you see how the kids, like, they rule everything. At the time of Jesus, like, they did not. They didn't have that kind of power. In fact, they were totally powerless. They were weak. In fact, they needed to be protected. And today, they still actually need to be protected. When you hear about a child who's been harmed, it's just like, oh my gosh, I wish I could have been there to protect that child. And Jesus says, whoever accepts this child, whoever receives this child in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but the one who sent me. So here Jesus is highlighting what? He's highlighting humility, littleness, guilelessness. Children are without guile so many times. He's highlighting simplicity. This is what he's highlighting. So he's like, whoever wants to care for the poor ones, rather than the powerful and the wealthy and the prestigious, I want you to be on the lookout for the little ones. actually. And when you look out for the little ones, when you receive a child such as this, you receive me, and you receive the one who sent me. So I read a quote recently, I can't remember who it's from, but I read a quote who talked about this, like the incredible gift of receiving a child like this in the name of Jesus. And in doing that, it is that causes the Holy Trinity to come and dwell in us. What an incredible gift that is. So anyway, so like Jesus, once again, he takes their worldly perspective and he just flips it completely on its backside. Completely. So that now it's like, look, you think this is what this is all about. You think that it's all about honor and prestige and power, when in reality it is about littleness and simplicity and humility. That's what it's about. It's not about what you think, but instead it's like, and so in some ways, you read this and it's like, okay, you think of Jesus, like there could be a sense of exasperation of like, okay, you gotta get your mind around this, and you're having a tough time with it. You've got to get your mind around this because this is so important. And of course, we know that they eventually get it in a very real way on the day of Pentecost. But it takes them up to the day of Pentecost to really understand it, to really grasp it. And so in the meantime, Jesus is just willing to teach them and teach them and teach them and teach them over and over and over again. Why? Because he is the righteous one who knows that his own disciples are called to be righteous ones, like we heard in our first reading. But being righteous ones, they're living in a world of people who are wicked, who are seeking to tempt them toward honor and glory and power. There's it's not in this scene obviously, but there's another scene where James and John ask to sit at the right and the left of Jesus, and he says, that's not for you, it's not for me to decide. And it says the other 10 became indignant, and Jesus' response is, you know that the powerful exert their influence over them. You know this, that there's a particular influence of the powerful, of the wealthy, of the prestigious. There's a particular influence that they exert on anyone who's willing and even unwilling, but vulnerable to those sorts of things. They exert their influence in such a way that it causes us to think unclearly. It causes us to go down that path of madness rather than the path of righteousness. And so it is so important for us to have our eyes, like Jesus, to have our eyes fixed on God and to be fixed on godly ways, not on worldly ways, but on godly ways. That's so big, so important for us. Okay, so that's our first reading, our gospel. So good. We're going to continue in James, and James actually again kind of matches up with this really well. So it's going to be a really neat connection once we get there. Okay, God bless you.